Alright, Hip Cats, hopefully this is the last of 3 videos introducing the Julio Claudians to you. Now, we have an immense task in the next 15 minutes. I have to properly explain the fall of the empire, the rise and fall of Julius Caesar, and the rise of a sweaty, asthma-ridden, acne-prone teen called Octavian, who became Augustus, the first Julio-Claudian emperor. Now, in the last video, I talked about the Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius and their land reforms. So basically, these two men at various times, Tiberius in 133 BCE, they're elected to a political position called the Tribune of the Plebs, or the Tribune Plebis. This position is really powerful within the Roman structure. Again, we're going to be looking at that later in the Senate video that I'll make. This position is basically charged with looking after the political needs of the plebeians, who we know are the underclass of Roman citizenry. Tiberius takes his role really seriously and sees a need for serious land reform. And we know that the patricians control the land. That's where they draw their wealth from. However, in around about 133 BCE, there was this problem of public land ending up in the hands of large landholders, and it had to do with this really arcane law. This is something that historians spend their whole life looking at. We're not going to go into too much detail about it. The impact of this reform, it didn't actually work really, but the impact of this reform is really important. So anyway, Tiberius Gracchus tries to get this law up and running. He gains enough support for it in the Senate. However, it is so unpopular with some members, obviously, because the Senate being the patricians driving their wealth from land, that he ends up being murdered, essentially. Murdered in the streets by the clients of those patricians who oppose him. Okay. Then what ends up happening some 10 years later is his brother Gaius is elected to the same position. And he continues his process of land reform, which would benefit the plebs, give them more wealth and potentially more political power. However, again, he's actually killed by patrician lackeys before he can see this legislation through. Both Tiberius and Gaius come from the plebeian class, and this is really important. Although their land reform policies did not succeed, what it does show is this idea of crisis. It brings it to this idea of crisis within the Roman world and within the Republic. The plebeians now are starting to wake up and recognise their political power and recognise that they too deserve a proper seat at the table. They won't be held down by patricians anymore, and this creates anxiety within the patrician class, as you could well imagine. When we talked about crisis in the last video, we also looked at the Roman army. I'm not a military historian at all. I kind of tune off when someone says army or battle. I'm kind of more of a cultural historian, but I just want to show you this picture. Okay, so this picture here is a picture of one of the great Roman generals. His name is Marius. Okay, Marius is basically the engineer of something called the Marian reforms. Sounds kind of Catholic, but it's not. I'll just get up a sheet. Okay, so the Marian reforms were this massive sweeping reform of the Roman army. And I mentioned before that the army of the Republic was kind of a massive accident. It was full of untrained soldiers with unstandardized equipment, led by some dude, and raised for short periods of time to deal with minor infractions. As the empire grew, there became a massive need for a more professional, a better army, essentially. So what Marius proposed, and this was during his first session as consul, which is apparently like the de facto rulership of Rome. Again, we'll talk about that when we look at the Senate. Basically, Marius wanted to propose to take the army into a period of professionalism. So before the Marian reforms, which took place in 107 BC, so not too long after Gaius Gracchus, before the Marian reforms, the army service was open to the wealthy, You could only serve in the army for a fixed term, which was usually 12 months, which isn't really very long if you're dealing with a long conflict. And they were led by one of the consuls. So every single year, the Senate elected 2 consuls. It was essentially the highest political position in the land. The reason there were 2 consuls was sharing of power, so that idea of fear of kingship is present, but also the idea that if a military threat arose, one of the consuls would leave Rome and lead the army. So obviously you get military leadership of a huge variety, some great, some bad. What Marius proposed to do was make the Roman army professional. So they were paid and they had terms of service, and it was usually about 20 years, which is actually what our army is, as being the daughter of a military man. So they were professional paid troops. Enlisting in the army was only open to citizens at this time. They had standardised training and standardised weapons, which the government would provide, and they also had retirement packages, which their general was responsible for, and that's really important. So hopefully you guys can see how these reforms would be beneficial. After the Marian reforms, the Roman army became an unstoppable military machine. Different legions were posted around the empire for security. Rome was able to sort of enforce its borders and essentially like Romanize the Roman Empire. That's how culture spread, was through the army. So it's seen as a Romanizing force. There's obviously lots of security, and also it kept the plebs out of Rome. One of the things that I find really cute are these like class snobberies that exist in Rome. The patricians were constantly talking about how the plebeians just laid around all day and made their city ugly, and and that's something we kind of see in our society too. So the idea that enlisting in the army would be open to all citizens, wealthy or poor, basically kind of got them out of Rome and gave them a job, which was important. But the Marian reforms possibly had more of a bad impact on the Republic as it stood. Essentially, what happened was generals gained ridiculous amounts of power because they had soldiers at their beck and call. These generals, and Marius, funnily enough, was the first one, could manipulate politics because they had an army behind them. And the reason why these troops became so loyal to their generals was this idea that their retirement, that each soldier's retirement package was the responsibility of his general. And I've just put down here, army becomes a political player. So essentially what we have after the Marian reforms and the Gracchi, and the attempted reforms of the Gracchi, is a period where generals actually dominate Roman politics. And you may have heard of some of these names. Marius is the first one. He spends a period of 7 years monopolizing the top political positions in Rome. During that time, he gets rid of his enemies. So we talked earlier about how the patrician class is shrinking. During this period after the Marian reforms, they continue to shrink because they're all knocked off. Marius got rid of his opponents until a dude called Sulla rose up with a stronger army and got rid of Marius. Fortunately for Rome, Sulla was actually a nice guy, and he hands back ultimate political power for a little bit. But then in his place, we get this guy, and I just have to show you his picture. Pompey the Great. Okay, Pompey is probably one of the greatest generals in Rome, probably second only to Caesar and this poor guy called Tiberius, who we're going to look at. But Pompey was a victorious general on 3 continents. His troops were ridiculously loyal, and again, he uses that military supremacy to basically intimidate the Senate into giving him political power. So we're already seeing the beginnings of this idea that one man could manipulate and control Roman politics. So essentially like the fall of the Republic is happening as we speak. What ends up happening after a period is, and I'm not actually sure how this happens, but what actually begins happening after the Marian reforms is that traditional structures are breaking down. Okay, so now that the army is open to all, the plebeians have another way of pushing their political agenda. The empire has needs which current institutions can't accommodate. So obviously we've seen that in the Gracchi reforms with land and wealth, and we've seen that in the Marian reforms with the army. What you end up getting during this period, particularly during Pompey's time, is you get the rise of two different competing groups in the Senate. You get the optimates, who I think optimates means first citizens. So they're basically like the traditional aristocratic senators. They want to keep the Senate for the patricians. They want to keep their own interests. And they want to rely on the traditional power structures of Rome. Conversely, you get the populares, who are new to the Senate. They recognise the power of the plebeians and they want to use that for their own gain. During the period 107 to 27 BC, you get periods of civil war. So that's when you get Marius and Sulla, you get Pompey, you get Julius Caesar. At the end of this period, one man rises up, and it's probably the man least likely. It's Julius Caesar's adopted nephew, Octavian, who ends up becoming Augustus. And what I'll do is I'll just take you through that really quickly. Okay. All right, so towards the end of this period, what you have is a bit of a compromise. So instead of one man dominating Roman politics, Pompey and a guy called Crassus, who in the end really isn't that important, end up entering a power-sharing deal with a young up-and-coming general by the name of Julius Caesar. And I'll just get this up. Okay, all right. Okay, so we've got 2.5 minutes left, but I'll just explain the first triumvirate, which was in place from 59 BC to 53 BC. It's really important in terms of the power during this period. So these three men, Pompey and Crassus and Julius Caesar, entered an agreement by which they would be mutually supportive. This led to a period of peace within the Senate because these three men represented the interests of both sides. You've got optimates and populares. Julius Caesar and Pompey both brought military support. Crassus had cash and patronage as his power support. After a while, Pompey and Julius Caesar have a falling out, and it's after the death of Julius Caesar's daughter, who was married to Pompey, to cement this alliance. After the first triumvirate falls apart, Caesar is, as you know, assassinated by his friends in 44 BCE, apparently to preserve the Republic. What this does is this causes a massive power vacuum that leads to more civil war. A second triumvirate is created with the supporters of, and I don't have a chart for this unfortunately, the supporters and heirs of Julius Caesar. So the second triumvirate is between a guy called Lepidus, who really doesn't matter, a famous dude called Mark Antony, and Julius Caesar's nephew, who was his adopted son, a small, weedy, pimply dude called Octavian. After a while, this agreement falls apart, mainly because it's weird. Mark Antony, who's married to Octavian's sister, Octavia, runs away with a little woman called Cleopatra the Seventh of Egypt. Octavian is then able to use his influence in Rome to rise up against Mark Antony, eliminate him, and take power for himself. And that's the beginning of the Julio-Claudian period. What we'll be doing in the first day back is we'll be looking at the impact of the death of Augustus and the Julio-Claudians' relationship with the Senate. Hopefully you found these videos enlightening and interesting. Please come to class aimed with any questions that you might have. I'm expecting heaps. I'm not an expert. I love Roman history. It's my specialty, particularly this period. But hopefully I've made this topic interesting, and I've delivered this information in a way that isn't more reading for you during the holidays. Anyway, guys, I hope you're having a good Christmas break. I'm really looking forward to teaching you all. Have a good one, and I'll